The morning my adoptive parents handed me a cardboard box and told me to be out by noon. It was -18 outside, and the heat in our house had already been turned off. I remember the cold more than anything else. Not the emotional kind, though there was plenty of that too. I mean the physical cold. The kind that gets into the walls of an old Ontario farmhouse and just stays there, settled into the bones of the place like it belongs. I was standing in the kitchen in my socks, holding a mug of tea that had gone lukewarm, and my mother was leaning against the counter with her arms folded, not looking at me. My father was already at the door with his coat on. Like they had somewhere to be. Like this was an errand. I was 31 years old. I had grown up in that house. I had helped paint the porch when I was 9. I had shoveled that driveway every winter for 22 years. The box had my birth certificate in it, a few old photographs I didn't recognize, and an address written on a post-it note in my mother's handwriting. She had pressed it into my palm without making eye contact and said, almost too quietly, "You should know where you actually came from." That was all. No explanation. No apology. No context for why today, why now, why this particular Tuesday in February when the sky was the color of old concrete, and I had $300 in my checking account and nowhere to go. I put my coat on. I picked up the box. And I walked out of that house on a road outside of Barrie, Ontario, into weather that had no interest in how I was feeling. My name is Cora, and I am 34 now. It took me 3 years to understand what that morning actually was. Not the end of something. The beginning. I had known in the vague and unspoken way that children know things they are never directly told, that I was adopted. No one ever sat me down and said the words. But there were photographs on the mantle that stopped at a certain year. There was a drawer in my mother's bedroom that was always locked. There was the way certain relatives looked at me sometimes at Christmas, with something careful and weighted in their eyes that I could never quite name. I had stopped asking questions about it when I was around 12. Not because I found answers, but because I learned that asking made my mother's jaw tighten in a way that meant the subject was being closed. Permanently. And you learn, when you are a child who does not feel entirely secure in her place in a family, that the cost of pushing too hard might be something you cannot afford. So I grew up. I went to Lakehead for 2 years before the money ran out. I came back home because there was nowhere else to go, and my parents said I could stay as long as I was working. I got a job at a garden center outside of town, then at a building supply company doing inventory. I saved a little. I didn't save enough. I was still there at 31, still in the same bedroom with the same wallpaper, still waiting for a life that felt like it actually fit me. And then one Tuesday in February, my parents handed me a cardboard box and a post-it note with an address, and I was standing on a frozen road trying to figure out what came next. I sat in my car for a long time before I started it. I turned the heat on full and put my hands in front of the vents and just sat there. The address on the note was for a town called Merrickville. Small place, about 2.5 hours east, down near the Rideau River. I had driven through it once, years before, on a road trip with a friend who wanted to see the locks. I remembered it as quiet, stone buildings, water. I had no plan. I had a box, a post-it note, and a tank of gas. I pulled out of the driveway and I did not look in the rearview mirror. Not because I was strong. Because I didn't trust myself if I did. The drive east was the kind of drive that Ontario does in February, flat and pale and relentless. The highway cutting through fields that were just white in every direction. I stopped once at a Tim Hortons outside of Peterborough and sat with a coffee and tried to think clearly. I did not manage it. I just drove. Merrickville in winter is the kind of quiet that city people describe as peaceful, and that people who grew up in it describe as lonely. Main Street was mostly shut down, a few shops open, ice on the sidewalks. I drove past it slowly and then punched the address into my phone. It took me to a side street off the main road, past a covered bridge and down along the river. The house was a narrow 2-story with green shutters and a woodpile that had been stacked with real care against the sidewall. Smoke from the chimney. A light on inside. I sat in front of it for probably 10 minutes. A woman came out before I got out of the car. She was in her late 60s, wearing a puffy vest over a flannel shirt, her silver hair pulled back, and she was holding a pair of work gloves, like she had been interrupted mid-task. She looked at my car and then at me through the windshield, and something moved across her face that I did not have a word for yet. I got out. The cold hit me immediately. We stood there looking at each other across a short front path, and she said, "You must be Cora." I said, "I think so." She laughed, just once, something short and a little undone. Then she said, "Come inside, it's too cold for this out here. And there's a lot your grandmother has been waiting a very long time to tell you." I did not know I had a grandmother. Her name was Beverly, and she was not my grandmother herself, but had been her closest friend for over 40 years. My grandmother, she told me as she put a kettle on and I stood in her front hallway still in my coat, was a woman named Iris, and Iris lived 20 minutes away and had been expecting me for the better part of 3 years. Not because she knew I was coming today, but because she had been ready every day for 3 years in case I ever arrived. Beverly drove me. She did not ask if I wanted her to. She just said, "Leave your car here. I'll bring you back after." And I got into her truck without question because I had lost the ability to make decisions, and someone making them for me was the only thing I could absorb right now. The drive took us along the river and then up a gravel road that cut through a stand of old maples, bare now, their branches gray against the white sky. The property at the end of it was a working one. A big kitchen garden put to bed for winter, raised beds under snow, a small greenhouse off to one side with light inside it. Chickens. A barn that looked like it had been added to a few times over the years. And a woman coming around from the back of the house with a basket of firewood balanced on her hip, who stopped when she saw the truck coming. She set the basket down. She waited. She was 73 years old, and she did not look like what I had been quietly conditioned to expect from a 73-year-old woman. She was sturdy and straight, her hair white and cut short, her face weathered in the way of people who have spent their lives outdoors. She was wearing rubber boots and a canvas coat. She looked like someone who had work to do and had simply paused it. When I got out of the truck and she saw my face clearly in the winter light, she went very still. Then she walked toward me, and she said my name not like a greeting but like an exhale. Like something she had been holding in her chest for a very long time and had just been given permission to let out. She did not hug me. She seemed to understand that I was still deciding what I was in relation to her. She just looked at me steadily and said, "I've been here. I just couldn't find you." Her name was Iris Callaway, and I am going to try to tell you what she told me that afternoon without losing the thread of it, because even now, 3 years later, it is still the most dense and reshaping hour of my life. We sat at a kitchen table that had been scrubbed until the wood was pale, and Beverly made tea, and then quietly disappeared into another room, the way people do when they understand they are not the right person to be present for what comes next. Iris folded her hands on the table and she looked at me and she said, "I'm not going to ease into this because I think you've waited long enough." My biological mother was Iris's daughter. Her name was Lorraine, and she had been 22 when she had me, unmarried, living in Kingston, working at a hospital as an administrative clerk. My biological father was a man named Peter, who had grown up here in Merrickville. In fact, had grown up in a house 2 properties over from Iris's. Iris had known him since he was a boy. She had thought well of him. My mother had loved him in the way you love someone when you are in your early 20s and still believe that love is enough to sort out every practical problem. But there had been a woman my adoptive mother knew. A coworker. Someone who had been trying to adopt for years and kept running into closed doors. And when she found out that Lorraine was pregnant and struggling and terrified, she had not gone directly to Lorraine. She had gone to Lorraine's sister, who was closer to my adoptive family than to Iris, and she had made an arrangement that bypassed Lorraine almost entirely. By the time Lorraine fully understood what was being organized, the paperwork was moving, and there were people telling her it was already the best thing for everyone, that she was young, that she wasn't stable enough, that this was the kind thing to do. Iris's voice did not break when she told me this, but I could see the effort it cost her. She had fought it. She had gone to lawyers. She had written letters. But Lorraine had been worn down by then, by the pressure and the shame and the exhaustion of being 22 and alone, and made to feel like wanting to keep her own child was selfish. The adoption had gone through. And then my adoptive family had moved, quietly and deliberately, and Iris had no legal standing and no forwarding address. I asked her where Lorraine was now. Iris was quiet for a moment, and then she told me something that made the room feel like it had tilted slightly. Lorraine had died 7 years ago. Cancer. She was 54. And here is the part that made my hands go still under the table. Lorraine had spent the last months of her life trying to find me. She had hired a searcher. She had registered with every adoption reunion registry she could locate. She had written a letter to be held by a lawyer and given to me if I was ever found. The letter was still there. It had been waiting for 7 years. Iris got up from the table and went into the next room. She came back with a plain white envelope sealed. My name was written on the front in handwriting I had never seen. Rounded letters, slightly left-leaning. The handwriting of a woman I had never met, who had wanted me and had lost me, and who had spent the last coherent months of her life trying to close a distance that someone else had created. I held it for a long time without opening it. Then Iris told me about my father. Peter had not known. This was the thing that arrived like a second wave after the first one has knocked you down. He had not known Lorraine was pregnant. By the time she was visibly so, the arrangement was already in motion. She had already been maneuvered away from him emotionally. She had already been told in a dozen quiet ways that she was on her own. He had tried to reach her and been told she had moved on. He believed it because he had no reason not to. He had been 23. He had believed what he was told. He found out the truth 11 years later, through Lorraine's sister, who carried the guilt of it for over a decade before she told him. He had come straight to Iris. And Iris, who by then had also lost contact with Lorraine and had nothing but grief and a locked-away grief about it, had finally had someone to grieve with. They had looked for me together, off and on, for years. The adoption had been domestic and private, and the records were sealed, and the law in Ontario at the time had not made it easy for biological families to search. Peter had eventually connected with an adoption disclosure intermediary through the province. That process had been slow and uncertain. And then, 3 years before my adoptive parents handed me that box, something had shifted. The intermediary had located my adoptive family, had reached out through proper channels, had asked, formally and carefully, whether I might be willing to make contact. My adoptive parents had received that letter. They had not told me. They had sent back a refusal on my behalf without my knowledge, without my consent, and they had held that secret for 3 years while I lived in their house and shoveled their driveway and ate dinner at their table. The box, the post-it note. The Tuesday in February. It had not been a sudden impulse. It had not been cruelty for its own sake. It had been a calculation they could no longer sustain. Guilt of a specific kind. The kind that builds and builds until the person carrying it cannot stand the weight anymore, and they set it down in the worst possible way and call it someone else's problem. My mother, when she pressed that address into my palm, had been putting down something she had been carrying for 31 years. She just didn't have the decency to do it gently. I sat with all of this for a long time. The tea went cold. The light through the kitchen window shifted as the afternoon moved. At some point, Beverly came back in and put more wood on the fire without saying anything, and I was grateful for the sound of it. I asked Iris about Peter, where he was now. She smiled, the first real smile I had seen from her, careful and warm. She said he was in Merrickville, had been his whole life except for a few years in Ottawa when he was young. He had married. He had 2 sons, both grown. He had told both of them about me years ago, when they were old enough. He had never hidden the fact that somewhere out there he had a daughter. He had never been allowed to know. She said he knew I might be coming. That Beverly had called him when I pulled up. That he was not going to appear without my permission, but that if I wanted to meet him, she could call right now, and he would be here in 10 minutes. I asked her if he was a good man. She thought about it for a moment, which I appreciated. She didn't rush to reassure me. Then she said, "He's been honest about his grief instead of hiding it. That's the best thing I can tell you about anyone." I said, "Call him." He arrived in 12 minutes. I know because I watched the clock without meaning to, the way you do when you are waiting for something your whole body knows is important. He knocked before he came in, even though it was Iris's house and he had clearly been here 1,000 times. He knocked and waited and came in when Iris called, and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at me. He was in his early 60s. A little heavy in the way of men who have done physical work their whole lives and are now doing slightly less of it. Gray-brown hair, a lot of lines around his eyes, the kind you get from squinting in sun and wind rather than from expression. He was wearing a barn jacket and work boots, and he had clearly not stopped to change, and I liked that. He looked like someone who had simply dropped everything and come. He looked at me for a long moment without speaking, and then he said quietly, "You've got your mother's eyes. She would have loved to see you." That was when I cried. Not the restrained kind. The kind that takes over before you can decide whether to let it. He didn't come to me immediately. He sat down at the table, across from me, and he let me cry. And he was crying too. And Iris just handed us both tissues and didn't say anything. And I was grateful to all of them for not trying to make it smaller than it was. I stayed in Merrickville for 2 weeks that first time. I slept in the room Iris called the back bedroom, a small room with a sloped ceiling, and a quilt that looked handmade and bookshelves with a mix of seed catalogs and paperback novels, and a particular kind of peaceful disorder that felt like a real person's space rather than a guest room assembled for a performance. The window looked out over the kitchen garden. On the second morning, I woke up early and watched Iris move around in the greenhouse in the gray light, tending something in the winter rose, and for the first time in my adult life, I understood what it felt like to be somewhere you were actually supposed to be. I read the letter on the third day. I had carried it around for 2 days first, unopened, in the inner pocket of my coat next to my chest. I sat in the back bedroom on the edge of the bed and I opened it. It was 4 pages, handwritten, in those rounded left-leaning letters. She wrote about being 22 and frightened and pressured, and how she had told herself for years that she'd had no choice, and then later had stopped lying to herself and understood that she had made a choice and that it had been the wrong one, made under conditions that were designed to make the wrong choice feel inevitable. She wrote that she was not asking me to forgive her, only to know that she had not stopped. She had looked. She had wanted to find me for every year of my life. She said she hoped I was somewhere cold and honest, because she had always loved places like that. I read that line twice. Somewhere cold and honest. I was sitting in a room in Merrickville in February. Outside it was -12, and the river was frozen, and the kitchen garden was under 3 feet of snow, and Iris was in the greenhouse, and the smell of wood smoke was coming through the walls. I folded the letter, and I put it back in the envelope, and I put the envelope in my coat pocket again, and I sat there for a while, just breathing. I met my half-brothers on the 5th day. Peter brought them both, his sons, men in their 30s, who arrived with their partners, and a lot of food, and an energy that was nervous and kind at the same time. They were warm in the way of people who have been raised to be, which is the best kind because it is the most reliable. The older one, who worked in construction in Ottawa and drove down for the day, shook my hand and said, "Dad's talked about you our whole lives. We've been hoping for this." The younger one, who was quieter and worked at an agricultural college in Kemptville, didn't say much but sat next to me at dinner and refilled my water glass twice without being asked, which is the kind of small thing that tells you more about a person than most conversations. We ate venison stew and bread that Beverly had brought, and someone opened a bottle of local apple wine that was better than it had any right to be, and by the middle of the meal the conversation had become ordinary in the best way. We talked about the farm, about what I was doing with my life, which was at that point nothing, and they didn't make that feel bad. About the locks in summer, about where the best cross-country skiing was, about Iris's greenhouse and whether she was going to expand it this year, which led to an argument between Iris and Beverly that was clearly a continuation of an argument they had been having for years, and that made everyone laugh. I watched all of this happen around me, and I felt something strange and quiet move through me, something I did not have a name for yet. It was not happiness exactly, not at that stage. It was something more like orientation. Like a compass needle that had been spinning for years, slowly settling toward north. I am 34 now. Peter and I talk every 2 weeks, usually on Sunday afternoons, sometimes for an hour, sometimes longer. I spent last Christmas at Iris's house with all of them. I have a relationship with my half-brothers that is easy and unpretentious and still being built, which is exactly right. I found a job in Smiths Falls close enough that I see them regularly, and I rented a small house near the river that I am slowly making mine. I never went back to Barry. Not out of hatred, though I worked through what could have become hatred over a long time, and with some help. I went back to something more like clarity. My adoptive parents had made a choice every year for 31 years, to see exactly the kind of people they were. They had made it again when they refused that letter on my behalf. And then they had made it one last time when they handed me a box and a post-it note and turned off the heat. At some point, you stop waiting for people to become different than they are, and you spend your energy on the ones who already showed you what they were made of. Beverly still calls me once a month, just to check in. Iris taught me to start seedlings this past spring, and I now have 6 tomato plants on my windowsill that she says I'm overwatering, but that look fine to me. Peter drove an hour in a snowstorm last January to help me when my car wouldn't start, without being asked, without making it a thing. He just showed up with jumper cables and a thermos of coffee and said, "I figured you could use another set of hands." That is who he has always been. Someone who shows up, who doesn't make it a production, who was just there, waiting, for all those years that someone else decided I wasn't allowed to know him. The address on that post-it note was the smallest thing my mother ever gave me. She gave it to me out of guilt and exhaustion, and she meant it as a closing, a way of putting down something heavy and walking away. She did not know it was a door. She did not know that on the other side of a 2.5-hour drive, through a February gray Ontario landscape, was a woman in rubber boots with firewood on her hip, and a man who drove through snowstorms with jumper cables, and two brothers who refill your water glass, and a letter from someone who loved me before I had a name, and a greenhouse on a river, and a life that had been waiting the entire time. She thought she was ending something. She was wrong.